The door closed, and for a few seconds, nobody in that room moved. Sandringham had seen private family talks before. It had seen Christmas smiles, stiff greetings, old grudges dressed up as tradition. But this was different. The fire burned low. The air felt heavy. King Charles stood near the window, one hand resting on the back of a chair, and Prince William, people familiar with royal routines say, looked less like a son being called in for comfort and more like a man being summoned for duty. This was the kind of meeting that changes a monarchy without a single camera seeing it. Outside those walls, the public still saw the usual royal picture. Carefully timed appearances. Calm waves. The polished face of a king doing everything possible to show strength. But behind those heavy doors, a harder truth was taking shape. Charles was no longer dealing only with public duty. He was dealing with time. And time, inside a palace, is never just personal. It becomes constitutional. It becomes political. It becomes family history in motion. Today we are diving into what many people believe was the moment everything shifted. Not in public. Not at Parliament. Not on a palace balcony. But in private, where monarchies usually make their real decisions. And what made it more unsettling was not just Charles's condition. It was the feeling that this conversation had been coming for a while. For months, royal watchers had noticed the change. William was no longer just the heir in the background, learning, preparing, waiting. He was becoming something else. His appearances carried more weight. His presence felt less symbolic and more necessary. When Charles stepped back, William stepped forward. When questions rose, William became the answer. Not officially. Not dramatically. But visibly. That is how power moves in royal life. Not with noise. With repetition. One appearance. One duty. One meeting. One silent adjustment after another until people suddenly realize the future has already started. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. Because if Charles had truly reached the point where private succession planning had to speed up, then William was no longer living in the calm space of one day. He was living in sooner than expected. That is a cruel difference. A man can prepare his whole life for the crown and still not be ready for the moment it begins pressing down early. Especially when he has a young family at home. Especially when his wife has had health struggles of her own. Especially when the royal family is already split down the middle. The crown was not just moving toward William. It was rushing him. People close to the royal beat have described a growing sense inside palace circles that William was being treated more and more like a king in waiting, not in ceremony, but in function. That phrase matters. Function changes before title does. The public hears Prince of Wales and thinks of the future. The palace sees a man who may need to hold the line now. And that changes everything. Because once a king starts leaning that heavily on the heir, every private conversation becomes loaded. Every invitation to a country estate feels less like family time and more like state business. Every pause between father and son starts carrying meanings neither one can fully say out loud. On this particular occasion, that silence may have been the loudest thing in the room. Charles had spent his whole life waiting for the throne. He knew better than anyone what it meant to be almost there, almost needed, almost central. He also knew what it meant when the institution stopped speaking in broad timelines and started speaking in practical ones. What many people do not know is that the monarchy always prepares for weakness before weakness becomes visible. It plans ahead, quietly, coldly, with the kind of detail ordinary families would find chilling. That is why the phrase, Operation Menai Bridge, hangs over this story like a shadow. The words alone are enough to make people stop. They sound distant at first. Technical. Almost unreal. But once Charles's health became a matter of serious public concern, that codename started feeling less like an abstract plan and more like a clock ticking behind velvet curtains. It reminded everyone of one brutal truth: the palace is always preparing for the moment after. And when the palace prepares for the moment after, the heir becomes more than the heir. He becomes the backup plan, the stabilizer, the unspoken answer to the question nobody wants to ask too loudly. William knew that. Charles knew that too. Which is why that meeting matters so much. But there was someone else in the room, even though he was nowhere near Sandringham. Harry. Or, more accurately, the absence of Harry. Because no matter how private the discussion was, no conversation about the monarchy's future can now happen without the Sussex question sitting in the corner like a ghost. Who is in? Who is trusted? Who is permanently outside the working circle now? Families may avoid those questions. Institutions do not. And Charles's final choice, if palace whispers are to be believed, was not only about bringing William closer. It was also about locking the future into a smaller, tighter shape. A monarchy built around William. A monarchy where the room is smaller. The access is stricter. The margin for family chaos is gone. That is where the story becomes painful. Because once a royal family starts shrinking by design, every absence feels deliberate. Every silence feels final. And William would have felt all of that in one sweep. The burden of the throne. The pressure of timing. The emotional wreckage of Harry's distance. The reality that the next chapter of the monarchy might begin before anyone has healed from the last one. He was not only being asked to prepare for the crown. He was being asked to prepare for a colder version of the family itself. That is what makes this so gripping. It is not just a royal health story. It is not just a succession story. It is not even only a family story. It is all three at once. A king facing limits. A son being accelerated toward power. A brother being edged farther from the center. And the public? The public mostly saw the polished layer. A wave here. A formal smile there. A carriage. A church service. A statement carefully chosen not to say too much. That is what the palace does. It gives just enough to calm people while the real movement happens off stage. But whispers do not start for no reason. Accounts from journalists and insiders reveal that what is happening behind palace doors now feels less like routine preparation and more like controlled transition. Not a public handover. Not a dramatic abdication. Something slower. More British. More careful. A shift in weight before a shift in title. And once that starts, it almost never reverses. The deeper you look at that Sandringham moment, the harder it becomes to see it as just another private royal chat. Too many pieces point in the same direction. Charles's health. William's increased duties. Harry's exclusion from the core working picture. The monarchy's obsession with continuity. The growing feeling that William is being shaped for immediate responsibility, not distant destiny. That is why this story refuses to let go of people. Because it feels like the beginning of something. Not announced. Not admitted. But unmistakable. And if that private meeting truly happened in the tone Palace Whispers suggest, then by the time William walked out of that room, he may have already understood something the world was only just beginning to sense. The crown had started moving. Quietly. Toward him. And this was only the first layer. To understand why that private moment hit so hard, you have to go back long before illness, before Sandringham, before these whispers of accelerated change. You have to go back to a family that has spent decades living in public while breaking in private. Royal stories often look glamorous from a distance. Up close, they are full of waiting, rivalry, duty, silence, and wounds that never really get the chance to heal. Charles knew that better than anyone. For most of his life, he was the man waiting in the wings. The longest-serving heir. The prince who had to stand near the center without ever stepping fully into it. That kind of life does something to a person. It teaches patience, yes. But it also teaches caution. It teaches control. It teaches a man how to carry frustration while smiling through ceremony. And when Charles finally became king, he did not enter that role as a young man with endless time ahead of him. He entered it as an older sovereign, with a lifetime of habits already shaped, a complicated family around him, and very little room for disorder. That matters. Because when someone has spent that many years waiting for the crown, he is not likely to let chaos define the reign that finally became his. William grew up watching all of this unfold. He watched his father operate inside a system that looked grand but could be emotionally brutal. He watched the marriage of Charles and Diana collapse under the weight of expectation, public scrutiny, and private misery. He watched the palace protect itself first, because palaces almost always do. And like Harry, he grew up inside the glare of a story he did not choose. But unlike Harry, William was raised with one impossible truth hanging over everything. One day, this would all be his. That changes the shape of a life. It changes the way you speak, the way you trust, the way you build a family, the way you imagine your future. You may be smiling in public, but in the back of your mind there is always a countdown. Not to a specific date. To a role. To a burden. That is why William's adulthood has always had two sides. On one side, there is duty. The careful heir. The man who understands the machine. On the other side, there is the deeply personal instinct to build something more protected than the life he grew up in. A stable home. A close marriage. Children raised with as much normality as royal life can allow. For years, it looked like he had time to balance both. Then life got messy. Then came Harry. For a long time, the brothers were sold to the public as a pair. William the future king. Harry the energetic spare. One steady, one restless. One shaped by destiny, one shaped by freedom. The contrast made them compelling. It also hid the pressure inside the relationship. Because being brothers in a monarchy is not simple. One brother is taught to become the center. The other is taught to support the center. That arrangement may look tidy in history books. In real life, it can be sharp enough to cut. At first, their differences seemed manageable. William looked cautious. Harry looked spontaneous. William seemed comfortable with structure. Harry pushed against it. The public loved both, especially after the years of grief that followed Diana's death. People projected hope onto them. Maybe this generation would be different. Maybe these two, having lost the same mother under the same brutal spotlight, would hold together in a way earlier royals had not. But grief does not guarantee closeness forever. Sometimes it creates it for a while. Sometimes it hides the cracks until later. As the years passed, the gap widened. Different relationships. Different priorities. Different ways of dealing with the press. Different levels of patience for palace discipline. And beneath it all sat the old royal truth that never goes away. One brother matters to the institution in a way the other never will. That is a hard thing to live beside. Then Harry left the working royal system altogether, and the emotional fracture became structural. This is where many people miss the deeper point. Harry's departure was not only family drama. It was an operational loss. The monarchy lost one of its most visible younger figures. The team around the crown got smaller. The image of a broad, modern royal future suddenly narrowed. What once looked like a flexible family firm started looking like a tighter and more fragile machine. That played directly into Charles's long-standing vision of a slimmed-down monarchy. For years, that sounded modern. Efficient. Clean. Fewer royals, fewer complications, more focus. But life has a way of exposing the weaknesses in elegant plans. Once Harry was gone, once Andrew became toxic to the institution, once illness struck the king and trouble touched the Princess of Wales too, that slimmed down idea stopped looking sleek. It started looking risky. And that risk moved straight toward William. Because every time the palace circle got smaller, every responsibility left behind by someone else landed harder on the heir. Every gap in the system made him more central. Every family fracture turned him into a more necessary figure. It was slow at first. Then suddenly it wasn't. Royal insiders remember how William's role began changing in tone even before it changed in title. He was no longer being discussed just as the next king. He was being talked about as a man whose judgment mattered now. A man whose choices could affect the shape of the monarchy now. A man the institution had to depend on now. That is not a light shift. That is a life shift. And it happened while William was trying to protect his wife and children from the exact kind of emotional damage he and Harry had lived through as boys. He was trying to build a normal family life inside one of the least normal systems on Earth. That tension sits at the heart of everything. Then there were the warning signs inside the palace itself. The monarchy began tightening around reliability. Familiar figures who could be trusted to do the job quietly and without scandal became more valuable. Princess Anne, Prince Edward. The old-school royals who understood service without theatrics. That told observers something important. The palace was no longer interested in emotional complexity. It wanted function. And in a crisis, function beats sentiment every time. That is also why Harry's distance started looking less temporary and more defining. Even if legal technicalities remained, the working core of the monarchy was settling into a different shape. A future shape. A William-era shape. Not broad. Not forgiving. Tighter. That had to sting. Not just for Harry. For Charles too. Because for all the institutional logic, this is still a father looking at one son as the future, and another son as the unresolved wound in the family story. A king may think strategically. A father still feels the loss. And William, sitting between those realities, had to carry both. The duty of being chosen. The sorrow of knowing what that choice meant for the brother now standing outside the circle. Then came the final piece of pressure, health. Once illness entered the family at the top and the center, every old timeline broke. Charles could no longer assume a slow, steady reign untouched by serious disruption. William could no longer count on gradual preparation while building his own home life in peace. The monarchy's future stopped being a neat sequence and became a moving emergency plan. That is when backstory turns into momentum. That is when private conversations stop being optional. That is when fathers call sons into quiet rooms and speak to them differently. Because by then, the old question was no longer, when will William take on more? The real question had become, how much more and how soon? The crisis did not arrive with one explosion. That is what made it so unnerving. There was no single headline big enough to contain it. No dramatic statement saying the monarchy had entered dangerous ground. Instead, it came in layers. A diagnosis. A reduced schedule. Careful public reassurances. Then more dependence on William. Then more whispers. Then more visible signs that palace life was adjusting around a truth it still did not want to say plainly. On this particular occasion, the atmosphere around the royal family had already changed. Charles was still appearing in public when he could. The image mattered. The monarchy survives on continuity, and continuity must be seen. A king who disappears completely invites panic. A king who appears, even selectively, signals control. So the palace did what it always does best. It calibrated the picture. Enough visibility to steady the public. Enough privacy to keep the real depth of concern contained. But people are not blind. They could sense that William was being used differently. He was not just stepping in. He was absorbing impact. That may sound small, but in royal life it is huge. The heir is always nearby, always ready, always important. But there is a difference between being important in theory and essential in practice. Once William started looking essential, the public mood shifted. So did the media mood. Even when headlines stayed respectful, the undertone changed. Less. Future king. More. Man carrying the monarchy's next phase already. That is a very different kind of pressure. Because William was not dealing only with state duty. At home, Catherine's health had already shaken the family. Their children were still young. He had spent years trying to build a household that felt warmer, closer, more grounded than the royal homes he had grown up in. And now, while trying to protect that private world, he was being pulled more forcefully into the public one. His family needed him at home, and the crown needed him everywhere else. That is the kind of conflict that does not show on a palace balcony. It shows in tired eyes, in careful language, in the way a person becomes more guarded because every emotion now has consequences. Accounts from journalists and insiders reveal that this was the stage when palace whispers turned sharper. Not wild fantasy. Something more controlled than that. The kind of whisper that starts with phrases like, "The mood has changed," or "The planning is different now," or "More responsibility is being shifted quietly." Those whispers matter because they are rarely about one dramatic event. They are about atmosphere. An atmosphere inside royal circles often tells you more than official statements ever will. Then came the private talk that people still keep circling back to. Sandringham. A place tied to family routine, yes, but also to serious private moments. A place where the monarchy can step away from public noise and deal with itself. That setting gave the meeting an emotional charge before anyone even knew what was said. A palace office would have felt administrative. Sandringham felt personal. Which made the idea of Charles speaking to William there not only as a father but as a sovereign feel deeply plausible to many observers. Picture it slowly. The estate quiet outside. Staff moving with the usual discretion. The old royal furniture. The silence before difficult words. Charles, a man who had waited most of his life to be king, now having to speak not as the endlessly patient heir he once was, but as the monarch managing a clock nobody could fully control. William, standing there, knowing exactly what the conversation was about before it began. Not because the words had been spoken, because the atmosphere had already spoken them. Be ready. Be closer. Take more. Sooner. That is how a crisis sounds when spoken in royal language. Not openly, but unmistakably. The fallout from such a moment would not appear in a giant public scene. It would show itself in pattern. More tasks. More visibility. More careful positioning. More moments where William's presence answered questions Charles could no longer answer alone. And at the same time, one absence became impossible to ignore. Harry. In another version of royal life, a family crisis might have drawn the brothers closer. It might have reopened doors. It might have softened old bitterness. But the opposite seemed to be happening. The more serious the monarchy's internal mood became, the more the core working structure appeared to close ranks around those still trusted inside it. And Harry, whatever his blood tie, did not look like part of that structure anymore. That is a devastating thing to say about a son and a brother. It may also be true. Because crisis reveals hierarchy fast. It shows who gets called, who gets briefed, who gets asked to carry the load. And in this story, every sign pointed toward William. Not Harry. Not the memory of what the brothers once were. Not the hope of some clean family repair. William. Then came the darkest layer of all, the language of contingency. Not in official speeches, but in how people spoke around the situation. Once royal watchers started bringing up succession planning, regency talk, and Operation Menai Bridge in the same breath as Charles's illness, the emotional weather changed completely. Even if some of that talk ran ahead of formal reality, it showed what the public was beginning to feel. The reign no longer felt spacious. It felt fragile. And once a reign feels fragile, the heir starts being watched differently. Every move becomes part of a larger question. Can he hold this together? Can he carry both family and monarchy? Can he become the face of stability while still living inside private uncertainty? Those are brutal questions for any man. They are even more brutal when the world asks them while you are smiling in a suit and pretending everything is manageable. This was the point where the crisis stopped belonging only to Charles. It became William's crisis too. Because every step Charles could not take without help became a step William had to be ready to take. Every emotional fracture in the family became a political reality inside the institution. Every day that Charles remained king but needed more support created a strange in-between era where William was not king, not regent, not merely heir, but something harder to define. A man already carrying the weight before the title caught up. That kind of role can trap a person. You have responsibility without full authority. Expectation without release. Visibility without the clean clarity of a formal transition. You become essential while still being technically second. It is exhausting. It is lonely. And it is exactly the kind of pressure that changes a person. What happened next did not need a big reveal. The truth was already showing itself in the rhythm of royal life. Charles kept the throne. William kept stepping deeper into the work. Harry remained outside the trusted core. The monarchy's future began taking shape not through one loud act, but through 1,000 quiet adjustments. And by then, the hardest part was no longer hiding what was happening. The hardest part was pretending this was still only temporary. So what is the full picture when you place all the pieces together? It is not the fantasy of an overnight coup inside the palace. It is not a king handing over everything in one secret moment. It is more unsettling than that because it feels real. The truth is that monarchies rarely change through one dramatic scene. They change through pressure, through illness, through family fracture, through trust being narrowed, through responsibility being shifted little by little until one day the public realizes the center of gravity has moved. That appears to be what happened here. Charles remained king. That part never changed. But the conditions around him did. Serious health concerns forced the palace into a new state of mind. Not panic. Planning. Not collapse. Contingency. And in contingency mode, the institution naturally moved closer to the heir who could keep things stable. William. That shift may never have been announced in plain words, but it became visible in everything that followed. He was carrying more, speaking with more weight, appearing less like a prince waiting for some distant future and more like the man already holding the future in place. The title had not changed, but the emotional job already had. And once you accept that, the rest of the story locks into place. Charles's final choice was not simply about asking William to be ready. It was about deciding what kind of monarchy William would inherit. And that is where Harry's story becomes impossible to separate from the larger picture. Because the future being shaped around William does not look wide and forgiving. It looks disciplined, filtered, tight. A monarchy stripped back to the people the institution believes it can trust under pressure. That does not erase Harry from the family tree. But it does place him outside the working center of the next chapter. There is a difference between being royal by blood and being royal by function. Harry still has the first. The palace has made it increasingly clear he no longer has the second. That is one of the coldest realities in modern royal life. A son can still exist emotionally inside the story while becoming operationally irrelevant to the institution. And that appears to be exactly what happened as Charles's reign entered this more fragile phase. The working future moved toward William, Catherine, and the smaller core around them. Harry became part of the background tension, not part of the plan. That must have hurt Charles more than outsiders sometimes admit. He may be king, but he is still a father. And fathers do not stop feeling the shape of a divided family just because constitutional duty demands discipline. If anything, the pain may cut deeper in private because there is so little space to show it. That is why this story feels larger than gossip. It is not only about power. It is about loss. Charles lost the luxury of time. William lost the comfort of gradual preparation. Harry lost his place at the center of the institution. And the monarchy itself lost the illusion that it could glide neatly into the future without paying a human price. Public reaction to all of this has been fascinating because it reveals what people really want from the royal family. Some want strength. They look at William stepping up and feel reassured. To them, this is exactly how monarchy should work. The heir supports the sovereign. The line holds. The system survives. Others see something sadder. They see a family that never fully recovered from old wounds now trying to operate through new ones. They see two brothers who once represented hope for a different royal future now standing on opposite sides of a cold divide. They see William being pulled toward the crown at the same moment. He is trying hardest to protect his own home from the damage royal life can cause. And they see Charles, after waiting a lifetime to reign, forced to face his own limits far sooner and far more publicly than he would ever have wanted. That sadness is why the story lingers. Because beneath the palaces and titles, it is painfully human. A father trying to secure what comes after him. A son realizing duty has started arriving faster than planned. A younger brother becoming the silence no one in the room knows how to fix. Accounts from journalists and insiders reveal a monarchy now operating on two tracks at once. One track is public reassurance. The king is present. The institution is stable. The rhythm continues. The other track is private preparation. William takes more weight. The core team tightens. The next era quietly gets its shape. That dual reality is classic royal survival. Smile in public. Adjust in private. Never let the world fully see how much has already changed. But the world notices anyway. It notices when William starts looking less like support and more like structure. It notices when Harry's name is spoken more in relation to distance than duty. It notices when every appearance by Charles feels watched not only for what it shows, but for what it might be hiding. That is when a monarchy becomes suspenseful without trying to be. Because uncertainty itself becomes the story. And perhaps that is the hardest truth of all. This may only be the beginning. Not of a formal new reign, not yet, but of a new emotional order. One where William lives closer to the center than ever before. One where Charles must balance sovereignty with vulnerability. One where Harry, whether he likes it or not, may be remembered less as part of the next chapter, and more as the great absence hanging over it. The family story and the constitutional story are no longer moving separately. They have become the same story. That is why the Sandringham moment matters so much, even if the exact words spoken there are known only to the people inside the room. It stands for something bigger. The second when private truth outran public language. The second when Charles may have stopped speaking to William merely as a father preparing a son for a distant future, and started speaking to him as a king preparing his successor for a nearer one. And William, if he truly understood what was being asked of him, would have walked out of that room changed. Not crowned. Not named anything new. Changed. Because some transitions happen long before ceremony catches up. In the end, that is what this story reveals about power, privilege, and family. Power is never only public. Privilege does not protect people from pain. Family wounds do not disappear just because the walls are grand and the portraits are expensive. If anything, those things can make the pain harder to escape, because everyone expects you to carry it beautifully. Charles, William, and Harry now stand inside exactly that kind of tragedy. One man trying to keep the monarchy steady. One man being pushed toward its center faster than expected. One man left outside the working future, still tied by blood to a story that no longer seems built around him. And the silence between them may be telling the truth more clearly than any official statement ever could. Because in royal life, the biggest changes rarely begin with trumpets. They begin with a closed door. A quiet room. A father looking at his son. And the unmistakable feeling that the crown has already started choosing what comes next.